I'm not your father anymore. Those 5 words, trembling on his lips, hung in the kitchen air like a bullet lodged in the wall. Martha stood at the stove, gripping a wooden spoon as if it could shield her from the pain. Her husband, Richard, the man she'd shared 42 years with, whose hands had held hers in the delivery room, whose shoulders had absorbed her tears after her mother's death, whose eyes had shone with pride at their son's graduation, had just disowned his own child. Aiden, their 30-year-old son, stood by the door, pale, mouth twisted, eyes hollow. He didn't shout, didn't cry, just stood there, as if struck senseless, the world stripped of meaning. "What did you say?" Martha whispered, not turning around. Her voice shook like an old wire under tension. Richard didn't answer. He sank into a kitchen chair, buried his face in his hands, and began to sob, softly, almost soundlessly. It was worse than any scream. We all believe we truly know our children, especially once they're grown. Especially when you're a parent over 60. You've seen their first steps, first words, first failures, first triumphs. You've believed you understood them completely. But the truth is, children aren't extensions of us. They're separate universes, and sometimes those universes collide with ours so violently that everything shatters. Martha and Richard had 2 kids, Aiden and his younger sister, Lisa. Aiden had always been difficult, not in the sense of bad behavior. He'd been a good student, never smoked or drank as a teen. But he was different. Too sensitive. Too thoughtful. In school, they called him nerd. In college, he dropped out of engineering in his 2nd year to pursue photography. Richard didn't speak to him for a week. Photography, he'd said then, tinkering with the old lawnmower in the garage. That's not a career, Aiden. That's a hobby like your Aunt Betty's knitting. I want to tell stories, Dad, Aiden had replied quietly. Through a lens. Stories don't pay bills, son. Bills do. Still, Aiden persisted. He took a job as an assistant in a photo studio, lived in a rented room, ate instant noodles, slept on an air mattress. 5 years later, he was booking wedding gigs, then doing features for local magazines. Eventually, he had gallery shows. One of his photos was even bought by a museum in Chicago. Richard was proud, of course, but never said it aloud. He'd just nod when Martha showed him the newspaper article and mutter, "Well, at least he's not starving." Lisa was different. She followed in her father's footsteps, became an accountant, married a solid guy, with a good job, had 2 kids. Everything as it should be. Richard often said, "Now Lisa, she's smart. Knows how to live." Aiden heard it. And stayed silent. The conflict erupted suddenly, like a summer thunderstorm. It started with a simple dinner. Aiden came over with his new boyfriend, Mark. They'd been together 2 years. Aiden had never brought anyone home before, no girlfriends, no boyfriends. He'd just say, "I'm fine," and leave. But that evening he said, "Mom, Dad, this is Mark. We're together." Martha smiled, hugged Mark, offered him coffee. Richard sat silently, staring at the floor. When Martha stepped into the kitchen, he stood and said, "You're serious? In front of your parents?" "Yes, Dad. I'm serious." "You think that's normal?" "For me, yes. For Mark, yes. What about you?" Richard didn't answer. He just walked out to the backyard and lit a cigarette for the first time in 10 years. The next day, he called Aiden. "I can't accept this," he said. "It's not what I taught you. You never taught me anything like this, Dad. You just didn't know who I really was. I thought you just hadn't met the right girl yet. But now this. I'm gay, Dad. Always have been. I was just afraid to tell you." Afraid? Or ashamed? Both. The call ended badly. Aiden hung up. Richard didn't call for a week. Then he showed up at Aiden's exhibition alone, silent. He stood for a long time in front of one photograph, a black and white portrait of an old man on a park bench, eyes full of loneliness, and left. Martha tried talking to her husband. He'd wave her off. "It's his choice. Let him live how he wants. But I don't have to approve. He's your son, Richard." He was. A year passed. Aiden and Mark moved to another state. Lisa called her brother but didn't tell their parents. Richard and Martha barely spoke. The house grew quiet, like a hospital on a Sunday morning. Then came the accident. Mark was killed. His car swerved into oncoming traffic. Aiden suffered broken ribs and a concussion, but survived. He was alone. He didn't call his parents. Didn't write. But Lisa found out and told her mother. He's in the hospital, Mom. In Springfield. Martha packed a bag immediately. Richard sat in his armchair, staring out the window. Are you coming? She asked. No. Why? Because he chose his life. Let him deal with it himself. Martha went alone. In the hospital, she saw Aiden thin, bruised under the eyes, gaze empty. He wasn't crying, just staring at the ceiling. Mom, he whispered when she entered. She hugged him. For a long time. Without words. Sorry I didn't call. You didn't have to. I should have come sooner. She stayed 3 days, helped with paperwork, made soup, sat beside him while he slept. On the last evening, he said, Dad still hasn't accepted me, has he? He's trying, Martha lied. Don't lie, Mom. I know. She said nothing. A month later, Richard collapsed. A stroke, not fatal, but severe. His left side barely responded. Speech was labored. The doctors said he needs support. Emotional support, especially. Martha called Lisa. She came on weekends with the kids. But Richard kept asking. Aiden called. No, Martha answered. In truth, Aiden called her every week. Asked how Dad was. But never offered to visit. Didn't know how. One morning, as Martha cooked oatmeal, Richard, leaning on a cane, approached her. I want to see him, he struggled to say. Who? Aiden. Martha froze. Are you serious? He nodded. His eyes were wet. I was wrong. Those were the words Martha had waited decades to hear. She called Aiden. He was silent for a long time. Does he really want to see me? Yes. And Aiden, he's sick. I don't know how much time he has. I'll come tomorrow. And so they found themselves in that same kitchen, 3 of them. Richard in a wheelchair, Aiden with grief shadowing his eyes, Martha between them like a bridge over a chasm. At first, no one spoke. Then Richard raised his trembling hand and reached for his son. Aiden hesitated, then took it. His father's hand was cold. Forgive me, Richard whispered. I forgive you too, Dad. And then Richard said the words that shattered everything and rebuilt it all at once. I'm not your father anymore. Aiden froze. I don't deserve to be. After everything I said, did. You'll always be my father, Aiden said, and for the first time in years, his voice held not pain, but forgiveness. Even when you didn't want to be. Martha cried. Quietly, without sobs. Tears simply rolled down her cheeks like rain on glass. 6 months have passed since then. Richard still can't walk without help, but his speech has improved. Aiden moved back to town, renting an apartment closer to his parents. Every Sunday, he comes for dinner. Sometimes he brings friends. Sometimes just his camera. He started a photo series called Aging Parents. Richard even let himself be photographed, for the first time ever without a tie, smiling a smile no one had seen since 1998. Lisa was jealous at first. But then she understood. This wasn't competition. It was healing. We older folks often think we know how things should be, what's right, what's wrong. We raised our kids in a world that's already gone, then demand they live by our rules, forgetting their world is different. Harsher. Faster. More complex. And it has no room for our prejudices. But the worst isn't that we're wrong. The worst is when we don't ask for forgiveness, when pride matters more than love. Richard lost nearly a year before he understood that. Aiden nearly lost his father forever. But they found their way back, not because everything became perfect, but because they chose love over being right. If you're reading this and you're over 60, ask yourself, do you have an Aiden? Someone you pushed away because you didn't understand? Because you were afraid? Because you thought you knew better? Call them. Right. Invite them for coffee. Don't wait for a stroke. Don't wait for a funeral. Don't wait until it's too late. Because one day you'll say, I'm not your father anymore, and realize it's the stupidest thing you've ever said. And then it'll be too late. But if it's not too late yet, anything can be fixed. Even the deepest crack can be mended with love. You just have to go first. Martha still keeps that wooden spoon, not because it's valuable, but because that day, she wasn't holding kitchenware. She was holding the last thread binding her family together. And she refused to let it break. May your thread hold too.